All right. So maybe I'll back this guy up a tad, or not. That's okay. So this is, I'm going to start with a disclosure, and I know it's been said this morning as well by Stan and Ray. What I have to say here is this is just what the topic of the talk, which of course I found out about after I had written the talk. But the topic is how to avoid dependency or avoid. I think that's the name of it. Yeah. And so I'd like to talk about how I did that. But the way I did that is not necessarily the way that everybody else did it, and I have really learned so much at this conference, and I really wish that I had been at this conference in 2000 and probably 2004, at least 2006 when I started Working Villages, because that really would have helped me. So many lessons here, so many struggles that I had to go through that wiser people before me had already figured out, and I unfortunately did not have access to them. So people here, if you've been here, you've been getting a lot of wisdom. And so the way I've done things is a little different. It's by no means the way. The very first thing I'd say is, if you can find an organization that you like and you believe in, and you believe in their mission, do that. Don't start your own organization, because it's a lot of work and a lot of misery, and you just want to think about that. 90 to 95% of new NGOs, and I'm just going to use the word NGO because it's the one I use all the time. I use it interchangeably with nonprofit organizations, and I understand there's a lot of nonprofits do a lot of things other than NGO work, but in my small brain world, that's how if you hear the word NGO, I mean nonprofit organization as well. But 90 to 95% of them, when I started, went under in the first year. That was the statistic. I have no idea what the statistic is now. I doubt it's much better, but you know what? People learn, so maybe it's 89% or something. And so we'll talk about that. I did want to say one thing, because Roman's talk ended right before, right as he was saying the most interesting thing that he was saying, and so I wanted to just tag a little bit on that, which was that those 7 projects that he did all ended as soon as he left. And one of the first things I did when I wanted to start my nonprofit is I asked for advice, and somebody said, oh, you should do some internships with some other nonprofits and some other NGOs. And so I did an internship with a few, but one in particular that I did was in northern Uganda in the Karamojong region, and it was a rough place and made you question everything you knew about humanity. But there was a Catholic guy who'd been up there. He was running a Catholic organization, and he'd been there, I want to say 30 years, but we'll just say 20 years. He'd been there a long time. It was since the 70s, and that was 2004. So he'd been there, a good long stretch, and he was running a really exciting program. I heard a lot about it. I went up and interned with their program, and he'd give good speeches, and everybody'd get to work and so on. And what I found is the people there didn't really think I was anything special, and so as soon as he'd leave to go do something somewhere else, everybody stopped working. And that was like, okay, that's not good. And that happened, I was there for months, and that happened every single time he was out of eye shot. All the work stopped, and it was like, okay, that's not good. I don't want to do that. He later was called to higher places in the church, and being a good Catholic, he donated his entire program that he'd spent 30 years building, a large amount of work. I donated it to the church, and the program went under very quickly thereafter. And so I said, I absolutely do not want that for me. I don't want to go waste. Africa's a hard place to work. A war zone is a hard place to work. And I do not want to spend my time doing this, just have it all go under as soon as I turn my back. So that's why this topic is an important one to me, how to avoid dependency. And so it sounds like I'm about to give a talk about how to avoid dependency so that thing doesn't happen. That's not actually what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk I've never talked about this before because it's generally not the type of thing you talk about if you want to raise money. We'll talk about money very shortly. But I want to talk about how to avoid dependency across the organizational level. So in particular, well, I'll put it this way. My coach, I have just a super coach, and he gave me a wonderful Christian book, and I'm terrible at names, and I can't remember the name of it. I want to say it, yeah, I think it's called The Celebration of Discipline. I don't know if anybody here, show of hands, people have read that book. All right, great, some people know that book. Yes, all right, I'm terrible at names, but so the key takeaway of that book that I want to share here is what is the purpose of discipline? And the purpose of discipline is freedom. That's the purpose of discipline. And so when I want to talk about ending dependency, I want to talk about freedom. And so discipline is very much involved in this speech, and this is not necessarily what everybody else has done. If you can find an organization that's already figured out and you believe in their mission, and they've got solid donors and everything's working great, and they got great teams on the ground, then fantastic. But a lot of people here who are sent or called, or even those who just wake up and go ahead, to quote Stan, they're going to be faced with a whole bunch of traps involved in the nonprofit world. And I want to talk about how I avoided those traps with a shoestring budget and not a lot of great advice like you're getting from this conference. So these are just tools. Some of these tools you may use, some of these tools you may not use. With that said, with that disclosure, I'll go ahead here. And stick with me to the end. Stick with me to the end, and maybe I'll answer some of the questions that you hear along the way. So I am the president of a nonprofit organization, and what is a nonprofit organization? Well, there's a lot of ways to describe it, but as I see it, a nonprofit organization is a pipeline. And it's a pipeline that brings resources from one end and translates them to outcomes on another end. And I really like to focus on outcomes. Another way the jargony term that people use is impact, but I like outcomes personally just because impact assumes you're doing something good. In my experience, it is sadly the case that of those, you got the 90% organizations that don't make it in their first year. A slice of that and a good, healthy slice of the organizations that make it past the first year have outcomes that maybe are not the best for the people they're trying to serve, or even themselves. In all honesty, it's a lot of trouble to go through. So resource on one end, outcomes on the other end. You've got the pipeline in the middle that has the special sauce of the organization. So let's start with the resources end and the traps you face there. So I said this yesterday, but I'm going to say it again because I think if you say something twice, it sticks in the brain more. That amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. And when you are talking about a nonprofit organization, you can talk strategy all you want when you're scheming up the nonprofit organization and what you're going to do and how great it's going to be and so on. As soon as you try to actually do something, you find very quickly that you need resources. And there's all kinds of different resources that you're going to need, but if you want to do something overseas, there is a gateway resource that is absolutely crucial. Because hopeful visions and inspiring statements do not buy plane tickets. And if you want to hire somebody to do some piece of work that you don't know how to do, sometimes you can get away with a hopeful vision. A lot of times they might want to be paid. And so you find very quickly that you thought you were in the mission business, or you thought you were in the economic development business, you thought you were in all these things. Very quickly you understand that 90% of your time is in the fundraising business. And that's what, so but if you can sign up with an organization where you don't have to do that, all the more power to you. But if you start your own organization, you feel like that's the way you got to go, understand that right away. That 90% of your time is going to be fundraising. And I include other waking things that you do, like going to the restroom, or other things like that, in that statistic of 90% of your time. So all of your time will be spent fundraising, right? You can fundraise over food, so that's also in there. So the one thing that you'll find about fundraising, as you connect it to this pipeline idea and what's on both ends, is that the donors, and we'll just use the word donors, there's all kinds of better words you could use. I'm just going to use the word donors because I was a simple person here. Donors are very well-meaning people on the most part. Sometimes, people give for different reasons, and you never know. Roman was mentioning earlier about people with an itch, and that's a class of people that exist out there. There's also people, who really have done their due diligence and really just want to have some positive impact in the world and think that your organization seems like a good fit for theirs. The thing you have to understand about donors is they are removed from what you are trying to do. They are not involved in it. And what that means is that they may not have a perfect understanding of the logistics involved on the ground, and that's putting it very politely. And their idea of how you might go about doing something is more often than not a strategy-based thing, like that big brainstorming, everybody's sitting down. And when you show up and you actually need to make something happen on the ground, you find that strategy may not be a perfect fit for what's going on. But the donors, they also have their friends and compatriots of their own social class that they hang out with, and they go to donor conferences. I've been to donor conferences. A lot of really interesting, fun times you can have there. A clear-eyed picture of the logistics of day-to-day activities on the ground is almost completely vanished from that circumstance. So you have to understand that your donors don't fully understand what's going on and what is required to happen. But you have to please your donors, because if you don't please your donors and you appear in their eyes as not a good fit, then they will stop funding you. And so there's a lot of organizations that help with what are called best practices, which is like, when I hear that term, it is like the biggest trigger for me. Because best practices are pretty much designed, they're kind of like algorithms. They're kind of like the donors sit together and they see, what's sort of working for them or something, and what makes them feel good. And some organizations come together and chime in as well. And you get this sort of meshed out world, and everybody sitting in air-conditioned offices comes up with best practices. And the brutal realities of working on the ground are normally glossed over and not involved in that. So you have to appease the donors if you're going to get funding. You need the funding to get the work done. So that's the trap, is the donors also change their mind regularly on what they want. They go to a conference and they find out, like, no, this is the real way this should be done. I saw this really inspiring speech by so-and-so, and now they're pushing you. You have to go do what it is. And the other problem is these best practices involve resources. So Ray talked about, getting that ratio of what you're spending on overhead down and so on. And you have to hire people in order to raise money. And one of the ways to get that ratio down, to get that ratio of how much do you spend on projects, how much do you spend on staff down, is you raise more money. Well, how do you raise more money? You hire more people. And you get in this trap where you become. So we're not talking about people at the other end of the pipeline. We're talking about you become dependent on the donors. And if the donors say, well, you might consider shifting your organization this direction, you are in a tight spot because now you got a big payroll to make. And if you don't make that payroll, your organization could go under. You got a lot of people you don't want to be handing pink slips to at Christmas time. So that's a trap, and you find you'll compromise and compromise and compromise just to please the donors until you don't recognize your organization anymore. And I know so many organizations that I have been friends with, the founders of those organizations, who have been in that situation, and it is a tough situation to be in spiritually and mentally, even if they don't recognize the spiritual trap of this. So how did I avoid this? Well, I didn't always avoid it. It was sort of an evolved strategy. But here's the first, two things that I did. I built an organization that was based on being lean and based on being loyal. So this is very much against a lot of the best practices that are out there. And if you have another story, then that's fine. But and so how did I get lean? Well, I trimmed the organization down to the absolute bare minimum of what it would take to operate. And so that if we suddenly lost most of our donors and most of our money, we could still continue to function as an organization. So how is that possible? How can you build an organization that doesn't require very much money? Well, the way that I did that was I focused on loyalty. Trust is an important thing, and I love that Warren Buffett quote, trust is absolutely great. My coach says trust is better used as a scalpel than a sledgehammer, and that has been my experience. I have people who I would take a bullet for, who I have worked with. It's not people who would take a bullet for me. I would take a bullet for them because I love them so dearly. Do I trust them completely in every single way? No, I don't. Because no one is perfectly trustworthy and no one is perfectly saintly, and if they were that person, that would be 2,000 years ago, and we would know their name as Jesus Christ, because that is not the group of people that you interface with when you walk on this planet on a normal day-to-day basis. So, getting good intelligence on those people is key, and building relationships, but also knowing where they would likely betray you in, or where they would likely choose to side, maybe betray is a strong word, where they choose to side against the interests of your organization or your mission for their own situation, and then crafting the incentives of your organization around that. But loyalty I value more than trust, because when the money runs out, when the money is gone, if you have somebody loyal, they keep working. If you have somebody who's a true believer, they keep working, even though they're not being paid. And this happens a lot. I would figure out a project, how much money we needed. I'd do all the diligent work, and then I'd figure out, all right, I am a super optimist, so I just need to double that figure, and that's like the real amount that we need. And so I then go to fundraise on that, and what would the Lord provide me with? Well, probably about a quarter of my original sum is what I'd end up having to actually do the project with. So we needed a lot of people to do stuff for not actually what they would need to get paid to actually do that in a competitive situation. And an example of that is we built a dam, and we built that dam for $250,000. A previous organization had attempted to build that dam for $13 million and failed. So there's a lot you can get with free labor, and loyalty is the key to that. So I built my organization around loyalty and being lean, and that is how I avoided the donor traps. And there were many times where donors bolted, and that was okay. We survived, and we kept being able to do stuff. And that's what you find out is with those 90% of organizations that didn't make it, they didn't make it because they ran out of money. or something, or got burned out or something like that. And they didn't survive, and that's how they went away. Okay, so that's the trap on the first end. So what's the trap on the second end? The trap on the second end is, interestingly enough, going to be a discussion of the power politics of the area you're going into. And I know there's been some discussion before about this, and I'll have a little raw version of that. So if you want to make a difference in a community, you want to accomplish something, that's probably going to end up changing the status quo. And you have to understand that even if you are an abundance-minded person and believe in the infinite power of God and so on, the people you are working with probably see the world in a zero-sum situation. There are only so many resources, and the pie is only so big. And if my enemies start getting a slightly bigger slice, that probably comes out of my pocket. And so there are situations where a community you're going to work in may be totalitarian, but that is exceedingly rare. Few places are totalitarian where there is one power center that controls everything. Mostly what happens is whatever area you go into, there's a whole dispersed power center. And if you're in a place like Congo, which is a failed state, the government, first of all, is not one power center. It's a bunch of power centers. It's anybody with a title is kind of his own little power center. And the government is just one power center, and it may not even be the most powerful power center in your area. We had several different militias at any particular time operating around us, and some of them were vastly more competent and capable than the government. And so the government's ability to actually help you in that situation was none. And so relying wholly on the government is not a great strategy in those type of circumstances. What you want to know is what is the real power structure of the area you are working in, and not a theoretical or legal power structure. In the US, we have an understanding that what is on a piece of paper is true. You know, you know, the bank, I have a story. I raised money from a bank once, and I had all these forms and stuff I needed to figure out, and you know, I did all the forms, and they said, look, we can't help you. And I said, look, who is the person who has the ability to say yes or no on this? I want to talk with them. And I had 30 minutes to raise $150,000 from them. Otherwise, the planting, you know, our planting schedule was going to be wrecked. And so they told me the name of the person, and I went to that person. I managed to get a meeting, and had a discussion, and they said, look, you know, this paperwork says, you know, you don't work. We can't work with you. And I said, you know, I don't interpret this paper that way, and just came up with some song and dance on the spot of why their legal documents, and there's 6 lawyers in the room, didn't know what they were talking about. And they said, okay, well, we're going to discuss this. They discussed it, and 5 minutes later they came back and said, yes, you're right. And I walked out of there with a check, and that's a true story. And that is in the US, where we have all of the paperwork, and everything seems real. What is real is you're dealing with people, and there are people who can say yes, and there are people who can say no. And as soon as you come into a community, it's good to know what the real power structure on the ground is, and do your due diligence and figure out what the power structure is. Because when you show up, there is likely to be a honeymoon stage, because these power centers, and not just in government, there's church leaders, there's local groups, there's business people, there's a whole host of different power structures, and they're not monoliths. Each one of these power structures is competing with the other power structures, but they're also competing with each other. The business people may look like a group that you met with, but inside of that group, they're all at each other's throats, and they're all trying to undermine each other. It is a very brutal situation. So understand the power structure, and understand who is the person who can say yes, and who is the person who can say no. Those are if you can identify those people, you can start to build a strategy of incentives of how you can work through that power structure. Because when you go into a community, there will be a brief honeymoon period where everybody will try to figure out, everybody's going to be smiling at you, but everybody's going to try to figure out, are you their ally or are you their enemy? And once they figure out which camp to put you, which box to put you in, they will behave accordingly. Now, there are places where they won't go and kill your people, you know, if you work. And then there are places like Eastern Congo where they absolutely will kill your people and try to kill you if you fall in that enemy box, because you're an existential threat to their existence. You know, they have worked very hard to build their power center. They don't want to just give it up to some new power center that walks in who's not an ally of theirs. So beware of enemies, but also beware of allies, because the allies, I said they're allies. I didn't say they're friends. They're not there to help you. They're there to help themselves, and they see that you may be an ally to help their cause. And this may not always be the case. Every once in a while, you're going to find some really good-hearted people, and you should cherish those people. But understand, you will not be working with them most of the time. You may be working with war criminals, and that's what you have to work with if you want to do work in those places. So understand your allies, they're trying to co-opt what you are doing to fit their purpose. And if you all of a sudden start pushing against that, you're not their ally anymore, you're their enemy. So be aware of that. So you got your three options. You can maintain the status quo, and you can say, look, we're going to expand the pie, but everybody's going to get an equal increase in the size of their pie. That's a very expensive strategy. I never had the money to do that, so it's not really a strategy I ever pursued. You can get crushed by your enemies, or you can get co-opted by your allies. Those are your three options. All three of them lead to mission failure. And that's why in a place like Ruzizi Valley where I worked, there was 60 years of pretty much one development project after another failing. And we were able, so how were we able to succeed? Well, we developed a different strategy. And again, I didn't walk in there with this strategy. I developed this by getting punched in the mouth a bunch. And so, you know, that's one way to learn. So how did I do that? I understood the power structure. That's the first thing. And I identified the people who were going to be our allies, right? And then I built them up so that they could be strong and they could act as proxies to what we were doing. But to avoid the ally-enemy trap, I didn't let anybody know that that's what was going on. So how is that possible, that you could build up your allies and not let your enemies didn't like what was happening. They didn't know where to strike because they didn't know where all the things they didn't like were coming from. So how is that done? That was done through a great deal of secrecy. Most of the people who worked with Working Villages after we got off of that first farm, and after if you saw the presentation yesterday, after the dam failure, after that first failed project, most of the people who worked with Working Villages after that had absolutely no idea that they were working for Working Villages. They had absolutely no idea they were even working for a foreign entity. And most of them had no idea that they were working for anybody but the guy who was right in front of them. So we identified the local power centers inside of the communities that we wanted to work in. And then I only worked directly with a very few select loyal people. And so you saw one of them yesterday. There were others that I worked with as well. And I built them up so that they could be strong and have a plausible, be a plausible power center to come in and facilitate the other minor power centers that I would work with. And then we would be able to move in resources without the opposing power centers knowing that anything was happening. Because people are arrogant. And if they look at minor power centers, I mean minor power centers, I mean like some of these community organizations are really nothing in the eyes of the people with power. They're just a bunch of unemployed dudes or unemployed women sitting around with nothing better to do. And it's like they're at the, in some countries, people sit at the cafe and they just drink coffee and talk nonsense, They don't really have cafes in our part of Eastern Congo, so they have organizations that they do, and the people don't take them seriously. And so when they say they're going to do something, the power centers, it takes a while for the power centers to adapt to figure out something's actually happening. And if you move fast enough, if you wait until the right moment and move fast enough with these underling power centers, they can get things done so fast that people don't have time. The people who are more powerful don't have time to adjust, and it's all over so fast. Working in absolute secrecy as much as possible. And so, what does that mean? We stripped our logos off of everything. If I went to an area, I was just some guy's guest from some guy from somewhere else. I was just some guy's guest visiting somebody's house. If I went to do a site visit with just some people coming in, they're friends of so-and-so, they want to show them, this thing that's happening. But nobody really knew my name. Nobody knew that the people who were my right hands in these operations had anything to do with it. And if we had to hire anybody, they didn't necessarily know who they were being hired by. We would work through other organizations to hire people who were not at all associated with a foreign nonprofit organization. So all of this is very different than what you would call best practices. But what it allowed us to do was avoid the trap of either maintaining the status quo, being crushed, or being co-opted. So that was our strategy for how to work at that one end of the pipeline. So you've got the funders' end of the pipeline, you've got the other end of the pipeline. So what is the thing that we're missing? The thing that we're missing is the middle part, the pipeline itself, and there are a lot of traps in there. As I mentioned yesterday, when I went into Eastern Congo, I was a penniless, unqualified college student. And it may come as a surprise to you that penniless, unqualified college students are not the best people to solve the great problems of the world that have been unsolved by experts for the last 60 years in a community. How could that be? Well, it came as a shock to me as well, because I was also an arrogant, penniless, unqualified college student. And so how does that happen? Well, what do you need to solve the great problems of the world? You need will. You need the ability or the means. We'll say ability, because that's a bigger tent. And you need the knowledge of what you should be doing. So I just mentioned my schemes for how I managed to get the ability. The funding from the donors that was not causing dependency in my organization, and the people on the ground to do stuff that they might not have otherwise chosen to do. That's ability, okay? I had the will. I had arrogance. I had whatever it was. I was sent, I was called, whatever you want to say it. I had the willpower to do it. So will plus ability without knowledge is one of the recipes for pretty much every catastrophe that you can think of in human history. It is a very dangerous thing to do. And human societies, social organizations, are incredibly complex machines. A human is a very complex machine. If you have a partner, you know that. You can't figure this person out, and they're probably from your culture, okay? Imagine going into a different culture and having to work with a human and change that human's mind, to try to get them to do something different and change that person. That's hard. That doesn't scale up like machine problems. Like if you have two cars that have a problem, it's like a linear graph. If you have 100 people who have a problem and 100 different ideas, you have a mess. And the ability of an underqualified person to walk in with just a bunch of means and get up and go to actually solve that is very unlikely. It is far less likely that will happen than I'll get a problem with my car without knowing anything about auto problems at all. Well, no, car's too easy. We'll say a plane. Imagine you're on a plane, you're flying on the plane stops doing something that you want it to do. Well, you just pop open the hood and start banging around or something like that. You know, you have some theories or some ideology about how that plane ought to work. You know, you've seen the North Carolina license plate. You know what a plane should do. The likelihood that your plane is going to start doing what you want is far more likely than if you walk into a community and try to solve age-old problems by, with just will and means. So you have to have knowledge. So how do you get knowledge? Well, two ways that I can think of that I got whatever little knowledge that I managed to get. And that was through listening is the first part. And the second part is through walking. And so listening. So I just spent a lot of time telling you how the donors at one end are just going to mess up all your plans, and the people at the other end of the pipeline are just going to mess up all your plans. Well, actually, it turns out that the donors at one end and the people at the other end might know a lot more about the problem that you're trying to solve than you might. And so there's a lot of listening that you need to do to the donors at one end and the people at the other end. You have to listen in the right way, though, because what you have to do is sift through the knowledge that they have and the wisdom that they're trying to impart, and you have to separate it from their interests, because their interests may not always align with the solving of the problem that is at hand. And it's not just the sustainability itch that Roman was talking about earlier. It's also they may just have a very different worldview, or they may have very specific interests. I remember working with a king who was. I have no doubt he understood the problems of his community, and he was a very, very intelligent man, one of the most intelligent men I've ever met. It was in his personal interest to keep his people crushed and under his thumb. Because if they got wealthy enough, they would declare independence from him using the governmental process. But it was a feudal structure in eastern Congo. And so he wanted to keep them down, and he had zero interest in me doing any economic development. He understood stuff. He understood a lot of stuff. And I probably could have learned more from him if I hadn't, I don't want to use made him my enemy. I mean, I think no matter what I was going to do, that was how that was going to play out. But he had stuff to teach me. Everybody has stuff to teach you. You just have to be able to sift through it. So how do you learn from other people apart from there are other people you can learn from apart from the donors and the people at the other end of the pipeline. And that is people who have done what you have done, similar. And I had a lot of arrogance when I started because somebody said, "Oh, you should find out, what people who have done what you've done before you. What have they done?" And I said, "Nobody's ever thought of anything as clever as me, so that there's no way that I could learn anything from anybody." But I wish that I had Stan to talk to, because he really could have made my life a lot easier, and you might have seen a guy smiling in the picture of that in the picture of that rice if I had talk with him first. So there's people who are around today who have done similar things to what you've done, and they have a lot of wisdom to impart, and they probably have a lot less interests at stake than the donors, the people at the other end of the pipeline. Another great source is people from the past who have done what you have done. A lot of the irrigation work that I ended up doing in Congo was essentially plagiarism of what the Belgians had been doing 75 years earlier. They had similar ideas of community development through irrigation, and they had some successes with it. The Chinese have had projects in Africa that I also learned from that they did in the 70s, so before I was born. So you can learn, and then there's way back reading the old books, and I don't just mean the Bible, but I mean some of the classics that have withstood the tests of time. Like I love the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. You can learn a lot about pretty much anything you want to do to deal with humans from that book. Or I love Reflections on the Revolution in France. You can learn a lot about a unstable area if you look at that book. And Barbara Kingsolver's Distant Mirror was basically Congo with swords instead of Congo as it is today with AK-47. So there's a lot you can learn from the past. And I see I only have a few minutes left, and so I'm going to talk about walking. Walking, there's another word people use, which is experience. I don't like experience because experience leads to arrogance, and I'm arrogant enough as it is. And it leads to hubris, and it leads to ideology. Again, you get back in that trap of, I know what I'm doing. Walking is a different thing. Walking is a real-time feedback mechanism. If I say, well, I'm going to walk in a straight line, because that's the shortest point to the door, and then I see all you folks in the way, if I'm walking, I walk around you guys. If I have experience, then I say, well, I know that's the shortest path, so I'm just going to cut there. Or I know you have to make 1 or 2 diversions, so I'll only turn 1 or 2 times. Walking's a real feedback mechanism. There's I got that phrase. It's not mine. It's a Latin phrase. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it in Latin, but it means it is learned through walking, or is discovered through walking. It's like a discovery process. And so if you combine what you're learning from other people, what you're listening to from other people, you try to sift out the interests that they have at stake that might be warping their understanding one way or another, and you combine that with walking, you can try to apply a way and chart a course that you can actually see, is this working, is this not working? If something's not working, and this took me years to figure out, if something's not working that you're trying, pay attention, because there could be reasons for that, and it's worth you paying attention and going back and seeing if you can relearn what's going on, to have a little bit more humility and figure out how it goes on. So those are the 3 traps, but there's one more trap that I want to talk about because I got 2 minutes left, and this is the last trap. And that is that knowledge is dangerous to action. Because it turns out arrogance and hubris are a path to action, and they may not be a productive path to action. In fact, most oftentimes they're not, but they are action. And so the more you learn about, Stan talked about the consequences of your own ideology. If he makes a mistake, it's not his problem, not really. He can get on a plane and go to one of the other 67 countries. If he makes a mistake, it's the people right there's problem, the people under him, it's their problem. And so if you're doing development, you have the possibility to leave, right? The people there, they have to deal with the consequences of your ideology, of my ideology. The people suffer because I was stubborn and I had an ideological view of what should have happened because I had my understanding and it didn't happen to match with reality. And once you start to get some knowledge and you start to see the mismatch between your own ideology of what you're trying to do and what's actually happening on the ground, that stunts you, and that leads you to freeze up and not be sure about whether you should move forward or not. So how do you avoid this last trap? Because in order to do anything positive, you need knowledge. And once you get the knowledge, it freezes you up. How do you stop that? Well, I don't have the best answer for that. I think some of the other speakers here might have had better answers. The only answer I have is to listen. And who do you listen to? You listen to God. And you have to ask God whether to act or not act. And if you don't get a sign, well, whatever sign you get, you should pay very close attention. And if you don't get the sign that you want, don't be like Themistocles and go back and ask the oracles again and get a different response. Pay attention, because maybe God will say, all right, if you're desperate to go ahead and force this through, go ahead, force this through. But you're not all-knowing. You're not omniscient. I am. God is omniscient. And so if he tells you something, listen, pay attention and trust that his plan is better than your plan and behave accordingly. And 100 times out of 100 in my experience, it will be better, but just to be conservative, I'll say 99 times out of 100. It'll be better than what you had thought of. So that's all I have to say on that, and I think we have a question and answer session, and I am 1 minute over, so thank you.